This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I have my second of two interviews on near-death experiences. Susan Blackmore is a researcher, and she will be taking, I guess, what you would call the con position. I just finished an interview with PMH Atwater, who had a pro position. I initially tried to get both women together, but we were having some technical difficulties, so I'm doing them back to back, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Susan Blackmore is my guest. This is a second of two interviews about the near-death experience. Susan, if you could give a little background about yourself, your childhood, if you ever had a near-death experience, what got you started into investigating near-death experience and other things?
Yeah, it was absolutely an experience that got me started, but I wasn't near death. And this is one of the important things scientifically we know, that these experiences with tunnels and lights and out-of-body experience and all of that can happen just as easily when you're not near death as near death. I mean, it has to be something that sets it off, but you don't have to be near death. Yes, what happened was when I was a student in 1970, a long time ago, and I can still remember it, I had a very dramatic out-of-the-body experience. All I knew then was occultism and astral projection and so on. So I interpreted it as astral projection. And then it wasn't until 5 years later that the term near-death experience was invented by Raymond Moody in his famous book, Life After Life. And then I read all these stories and realized that it wasn't just the leaving the body and floating out and traveling around and all the things that I'd done, but other things that happened to me, going down a tunnel towards a light, the weird sensations of floating and so on, bodily distortions, going inside myself. I mean, all of these things turned out lots of people have them. So that really changed my whole view on it later on. But in a way, I suppose what I would like to say is that experience, which I can still remember pretty clearly, 45 years on, is it? 47 years on, completely has driven my intellectual and my personal life. I became a parapsychologist at the beginning, right after that, because I just thought, this obviously proves all these amazing things, telepathy and clairvoyance and life after death and spirits and souls. I was absolutely convinced, and it took me years of research to change my mind. But then I didn't stop. I kept thinking, but what was that? What was that? And that drove me to try to get into the mysteries of consciousness, to try and ask questions like, well, not how do we leave our bodies only, but when I'm sitting here looking at this screen with this room around me, how is the brain doing that? Yeah. It's extraordinary. Some brain cells firing away, and here are making, is that the right word? This rich experience of being a human, alive, speaking, listening to your voice. So the wider mystery is all encompassed in that, and I've spent my whole life trying to understand it and learning meditation. I've been meditating every day for decades and doing a lot of drugs and other ways of altering my states of consciousnness, all really driven by that 2.5 hours or so back in 1970.
Well, I had mentioned when I spoke with PMH about out-of-body experiences, alien abductions, and other satanic things where people have had these visitations from beings, whether it's incubi, succubi, aliens. I interviewed a woman once who claimed that she had out-of-body experiences, that she could astrally project. And I remember she told me that she had visited the planet Pluto. This was before the recent flyby of I forget which spacecraft showed photos of Pluto, and she had none of the features there. I mean, you would think that if you were able to fly by the Earth, you would be able to say, oh, there's North America, there's South America, this looks like that. And she had none of that thing. So do you think that, let's say, these kinds of experiences, out of body, near death, then, are internally generated?
Yes, I do. They're generated through everything that we know. Our knowledge, our memories, our feelings are all part of this whole amazing, complicated brain and body that gives us experience all day long and gives us dreams and everything else. So, my own experience when I expanded out into the universe, it was kind of, looking back, the universe as you might have at an undergraduate sort of, popular astronomy level. Yes, I expect she saw what little she knew about Pluto in those days, and that's what her experience was. It reminds me of, I did a lot of studying of spiritualism and occultism and so on in the early days, and it reminds me of the spiritualists who would talk to mediums, and the mediums would tell them that, the dead people in heaven knew physics and knew how the ether worked, and they didn't know that the Michelson-Morley experiment was coming and we'd find there is no ether and so on. They just always seemed to be talking in the physics of their day, which is what you would expect.
Yeah. Since we're doing these interviews back to back, I'm going to try to touch on all of the main points that I spoke with PMH, so that anyone watching these two shows back to back or in a series can, contrast her and your replies. I had mentioned in the interview that...
Can I just interrupt you a minute? In the introduction, you kind of characterized us. I so wish I could talk with her at the same time, but never mind.
Oh.
But you characterized us as pro and con.
Yeah.
But that's not how I like to think of it.
Okay.
I'm pro in the sense these experiences are amazing.
Yeah.
My experience, as I've already described, has kind of driven my entire life since then.
Yeah.
It points to big mysteries and big questions about the nature of the brain and consciousness and mind. What I am con, if you like, is just inventing silly theories and believing them without any evidence.
Okay.
But I'm not con the experiences themselves, because they do happen and they are important.
Well, yeah, and I want to just pick up on that, because I've known about half a dozen people who've had these experiences, including myself, and I use an example of my experience and another person's experience. In my experience, I talked about I drowned in a lake when I was 6 years old up in New Hampshire, in New England, and I met these two seemingly greenish tinged children. We went spelunking in a cave, and then we had some adventures, and I woke up back on a buoy being resuscitated by a lifeguard. Now, I don't know if I was technically dead. There was no doctor there, but they said they couldn't feel my pulse or a heartbeat and whatnot. And about a dozen years later, when I was in my late teens, I remember reading a few books on paranormal things, and I remember this myth called The Children of Woolpit, which was about these green kids who apparently were discovered from another dimension or whatnot. And I thought to myself, well, was my experience somehow a racial memory, or was I backwards inserting information that I may have come across later into my experience? And then in the second case of a person who I knew claimed to have a near-death experience when they were on an operating table, they claimed that they had proof because they were able to see a certain person do a certain thing with a certain thing during their near-death experience. Except when they told this to me many years ago, they 3 times changed their stories in 3 successive tellings. And I pointed that out. Now, this person, many years later, decades later, has winnowed that 3 different versions down to 1, which they say they always said happened. And I said, no, that isn't. So in the one case, my case, is there such a thing as racial memory? And am I backwards editing? And in the second case, I think the person is deliberately neglecting their own errors in telling. And I use the example of somehow women who have been raped misidentifying rapists and men being set free by DNA evidence. So my question is, are human beings just lousy at remembering things?
Excuse me. Yes, we are. How do you interpret the green children now?
Personally, I think I must have seen something like maybe Leonard Nimoy's old show In Search Of, or Eric Von Daniken kind of thing, or some television show with something. Or it could be, like we said, a racial memory or something that people draw from the same well. Alien abduction experiences, everyone has the same kind of thing, but that is very much like these 1950s movies where the aliens come to Earth and they want to save the Earth from nuclear war kind of thing. So these things get propagated in culture, and even a 6 or 7-year-old might be influenced without knowing it.
Yes, I think that's another important point about our minds, not just how how we confabulate, mix things up, forget things, and so on. But how very young kids pick up so much more than adults often give them credit for. But when I was thinking about the green children, I thought along the lines you were thinking, but other possibilities are that there's something, maybe that's what you meant by racial memory, but there's something about the way we imagine when our brains are going a bit wonky that leads to green. I mean, we know that different drugs will produce hallucinations in different colors. Perhaps there are a lot of green animals, I don't know, lizards and other things that we kind of associate. I'm not saying any of these are very plausible, but the way I often try to think is, do people come up with very similar things because our brains are similar in structure and function? And it might be just a very common thing, sort of Irish spirits and goblins and other things are often green. Green carries a whole lot of connotations. There's so many different things to explore. The important thing for me, and perhaps the difference between PMH, although I haven't really spoken to her, is that for me, I like to think up as many hypotheses as I can about what might explain something, and then actually go and get some evidence. Whereas very often the books that I read, sometimes I just despair. People go to heaven, describe heaven, and say, well, that's what heaven is like. And they seem to have no curiosity beyond that. And I'm going, well, why is it like that? Why are the pearly gates pearly? And why are they this big? And, I've been reading quite a lot of those I Went to Heaven books. And it's the lack of curiosity that is such a shame, because being curious about one's own experiences is kind of adds to the richness of life, I think.
Yeah, I always try to wield Occam's razor, that the best explanation or the explanation that's the simplest, that best fits the known facts, is usually the correct one. Not always, but usually. I had brought up the idea, though, that if we're thinking about near death, or there would have to be an afterlife, and I used the example of the old movie It's a Wonderful Life about ensoulment, like, souls waiting to be ensouled. Because if there's an afterlife, it would seem to me it would have to follow there's a pre-life, which would imply something like reincarnation, and that, souls are everlasting. I had asked PMH about, was she a pantheist, and thinking, she didn't say she was a pantheist, but she was a believer in pan consciousness, that, I guess every atom or every little quark or whatever substrate of matter there may be below that has some element of consciousness. I would take it that you're not someone who believes in something like that. For me, I think consciousness is sort of, human beings are a pattern, a very temporary pattern, and once that pattern dissipates, what is Dan or what is Susan or what is PMH is no longer. What is your idea about what constitutes the self then?
Well, I sort of will surprise you in a way, because I think panpsychism has, or in some versions, has something going for it. I'm not a bit averse to the sort of idea that, because the problem of consciousness is so deep and difficult, and dualism doesn't work, having a separate soul or spirit and a physical world, or mind and body and being separate, it doesn't work. So the idea that consciousness is somehow intrinsic, or that somehow some monist theory that it's all consciousness, I think about these kind of ideas a lot. But the second part of what you said, I totally agree with. In terms of personal consciousness, being you or being me, I take exactly the same kind of way of thinking that you do, that we are temporary conglomerations, that our awareness, our minds are because this body has come together for a very limited period of time, and when it's gone, so the same experience of being me dissipates. And we're learning so much now. This is what's so exciting to me. I'm just writing a new book on out-of-the-body experiences, exactly because the science is now getting so good about how the brain constructs the illusion that there's somebody in there. You look inside a brain, look inside a body, how could there be something else in there? You see all these brain cells firing, massive parallel structures going on in the brain. There's nowhere for a little me to be sitting and pulling the strings.
The homunculus theory.
Pardon?
The homunculus theory, that there's a little man inside you, and inside that little man is a little man who's inside a little man, like the Russian dolls.
That doesn't make sense. Yes, I agree. But nor does the soul idea that the soul is a kind of in a different dimension or something and is somehow influencing the brain. So why then do I feel as though I'm inside my eyes, inside my head, looking out through my eyes? And this, of course, is a question relevant to out-of-body experiences, because why do I sometimes think I'm on the ceiling looking down? But going back to now, where I feel as if I'm in here looking out towards the world, we're getting answers on that. We know that the body schema, where our arms and legs are and how we feel the shape of our body and so on, is constructed in the temporoparietal junction on the right side of the brain. We know that that's connected up with memories stored in the temporal lobe and so on to bring together the sense of being a continuous person. That's a self-image. We know that there are parts of the brain also connected to the DBJ which deal with ownership, and that can be affected by stimulating the brain. You stop thinking that your body is your own, and the sense of agency as well. All these in a normal functioning person like you and me now, and I guess all the people listening, most of them, are feeling, unless they're transcendent and enlightened, will be feeling that all these things come together. And that's why it seems so obvious that we must be an entity inside our body. But it's a very clever trick, a very clever illusion produced deliberately by the brain to help run the show.
Yeah, I mean, if you and I were walking around New York, London, Shanghai, Beijing, Tokyo, Mexico City, these large cities, and we're just walking down 2 or 3 blocks, we're going to be so bombarded with some sensory information, not only what we are consciously aware of, trying not to trip over our own feet, get run over by a car, but we're going to hear snippets of conversation going by us. We're going to get smells of flowers or maybe some malodorous thing. We're going to be hearing workmen working, rat-a-tat-tatting with things. And our brain sifts through that, but that information is going to probably still be contained somewhere in our backwaters of our mind. And I know some dream researchers believe that dreams are just sort of the mind unwinding with this excess sensory information from the day. So it would seem to me that a lot of these things that we think of, like you said, looking down on ourselves, are just ways for the brain to sort of, or the mind to sort of dissociate itself from the intensity of some kind of an experience. And if we're feeling a near-death experience, why wouldn't we want to get away from that, I would think?
Yeah, and this provokes lots of interesting questions that we can actually do research on. Ages ago, I was thinking about why should we, in out-of-body experiences, go up rather than down? I mean, why do we have experiences of floating up there rather than going down by our feet? You know, it's not the sort of question you ask unless you're really getting kind of obsessed with it. Yeah. But I decided to do a simple experiment several times with bunches of students and asked them, just shut their eyes in their imagination to imagine they're over by the door of the lecture theatre, or they're up on the ceiling, or they're down by their feet. And it's just very much easier to imagine the room you're in from above. And just asking them to imagine that, a lot of them imagined another floating self that was looking down on the one below. And it also turned out that those students who more often dream in bird's eye view, as though they're looking down, those students were more likely to have out-of-body experiences. So all these imagery capacities are closely bound up with these strange experiences that we're capable of having.
Yeah, and as someone who's watched a lot of films and has written a lot of criticism on films, you'll often get the bird's eye view looking down, especially in police procedurals, where you'll see the people moving around like ants or like rats in a maze, rather than looking up from the floor at things. And I think that's probably, I don't know, maybe this human idea to fly, perhaps. I wanted to ask you, though, about, because towards the end of the interview, PMH and I spoke of this fellow named Raymond Moody, who's sort of like the touchstone for the near-death experience. He wrote a book 40-some years ago about where I think, coined the term near-death experience. And I likened it to sort of like people who believe in alien abductions to Betty and Barney Hill, that before the Hills, there were all kinds of weird aliens in the 1940s and 50s that people saw. And then afterwards, all the aliens, or 98% of them, became these gray aliens with big eyes. And I was wondering if Raymond Moody's book sort of institutionalized the idea of going up towards the light, Or were any near-death experiences reported, say, in the 30s or 40s or 50s, maybe by soldiers in the world wars or something? Were they somehow different? Did Moody, for example, set a template that pop culture latched onto?
It's a very, very good question. I'm not sure how long an answer to give. To go back before 1975, when his book was published, there were reports of near-death experiences. But I think you're right about the template. They seem to have become far more fitting the template. But it's also a question of culture, because in the Western culture where people are reading that book, they more often seem to fit the pattern. But it's not entirely culturally produced, and the picture isn't very simple. But some other research I did a long time ago was about tunnel experiences, because I had that myself. Wonderful sensation of going down this great tunnel. And I read somewhere that people in India don't have tunnel experiences when near death. So I did a little study. I put an advert in newspapers in India and got a lot of people writing to me, and they did have tunnels. And this makes sense because we know how tunnels are generated in the visual cortex, the part at the back of the brain that deals with vision. When there's disorganized, excessive random firing in that part of the brain, for reasons of the way the structure works in that part of the brain, it will produce tunnel experiences. So you would expect them to be independent of what culture people are in, and that is true. But other things are quite varied. Before that, in the 30s and 40s, as you were saying, there are quite a lot of stories about people not coping well after cardiac arrest. So the Moody thing has, the being of light and people being changed for the better and more open-minded and more loving and more less materialistic and so on. But there's a lot more in the early literature of people being really disturbed after their experience and finding it very difficult to cope with life rather than easier. So in some way, that story that has now become so well known has helped people to look more positively on it.
Yeah.
Even though that's not the whole story, because the endorphins, these morphine-like chemicals that our brain produces, are probably the reason why most NDEs are blissful and nice, and that certainly helps. So there's a big, there's a lot of interaction between the basic phenomena of tunnels, the bright light, the out-of-body experience, which we know the brain basis of them, and then the more cultural stuff. The kind of heaven you go to, the kind of beings you meet is heavily dependent on the culture. I mean, Christians will typically see a heaven with gates and angels or not classical angels with wings, but wonderful beings and so on. Whereas Hindus will see Ramdoots and the Lord of Death and these sorts of completely different things that they've grown up with in their culture.
PMH had said that in her research, and I think she quoted 4,000 or 7,000 for different aspects of it, that about 15% of the people that she interviewed had what would be called hellish experiences. She said it might be as high as 25%. But have you, in speaking with any near-death experiences, have you found that to be about the range? Maybe 1 in 7 people claim that they had intensely negative experiences?
I have not done anything like the research she's done. She has interviewed so many people. It's fantastic. And I've only interviewed a few. A lot of my research has been more kind of lab-based or doing experiments of various kinds and surveys and so on. So I can't answer that question in that way. I can answer it from the what limited scientific literature we have on hellish experiences. And from that, there's a wide range, but it's probably somewhere in the region of between 5 and 20%, something like that, when people look for hellish experiences. Of course, that depends quite what you count as hellish. Yeah. And quite a lot of NDEs are like LSD trips and other mental adventures. They're a mixture. I mean, there are some cases of people who have a near-death experience that is absolutely blissful and wonderful, and then they go into a black tunnel or a void and they become terrified and it's really awful, and then a warm feeling comes and it all turns all right again. So there's not a black and white thing that some are hellish and some are good. One thing I would like to say about hellish NDEs is the harm that religion does with respect to them, because I've already mentioned that the endorphins in the brain, which help you in pain and in other stressful situations, and make this wonderful feeling of calm and everything's fine and lovely. They're probably responsible for that in near-death experiences. And there's a drug called naloxone which blocks those and is sometimes given to people if they have morphine overdoses. And there's one example of someone having a really blissful near-death experience, and then he was injected with naloxone because he'd had too much morphine, and suddenly it turned bad. So we don't really have enough research, but we have some to know that something like that is going on. So if someone has a hellish near-death experience, it's not their fault, you know. It's not because they're bad and wicked and they did some awful thing and God's giving them retribution by sending them to hell. But for pious believers, what really worries me is that a Christian believer or a Muslim believer may well think, if they have a hellish experience, that this is because they are wicked or bad. And that, I'm afraid, may make them, get really upset and feel bad and have harm on their life. But also they're probably less likely to talk about it.
Yeah.
So if that's true, then we need to get out, let everybody know that it's not like that. At least I don't think it's like that. But also it means it's very difficult to estimate just how many are hellish if people are hesitant about admitting it.
Well, you anticipated my next question, which I was going to ask about certain drugs that could experience that. But since you did so, I recently read a book by Mary Roach, which referenced you in it. It was called Spooks, and she talked about you working with a fellow named Michael Persinger about electromagnetic fields. What relation does that or his research have on near-death experiences?
Well, there are some problems with his research because he has this so-called God helmet, which I've experienced, which is a kind of adapted motorcycle helmet that goes on your head. And here, right above your ears, but next to, right on the temporal lobes, are solenoids that produce a complexly varied magnetic field across the head. But he doesn't publish all the patterns. He claims that with different patterns, he can produce different experiences. And I don't really know whether that's so. But I had some very, very, very weird experiences when I was in his lab having this thing done to me, which included the sort of bodily distortions that people often report before out-of-body experiences. So I got this sense that I was being stretched and pulled and being made incredibly long. And I had a sort of drifty, floaty feeling, which comes very typically, is the precursor to out-of-body experiences. There's a lot of research showing that out-of-body feelings, that's the kind of floating, drifting, I'm not in my body feeling, comes before the clarity of vision that comes later. So his research is definitely relevant to that. Also, he has the view that all mystical and religious experiences are caused by hyperactive activity, unstable activity in the temporal lobes, and that fits with a lot of other evidence about temporal lobe function. So his research is very relevant to that as well.
An area that I've never heard really explored in near-death experience is one that I want to bring up. About a year or two ago, I was reading a book and I read some online articles about the Department of Homeland Security and the CIA having sensory deprivation tanks, which they sometimes used in I guess you would call it some kind of tortures. We hear about waterboarding at Guantanamo Bay and that kind of thing. And I've also read things about non-intelligence, meaning information gathering, where people have been put in sensory deprivation tanks or rooms where they have, you know, yard thick padding and there's no light whatsoever, and that the only access to the outside world is just, you know, a little atmosphere, oxygen allowed in. And these people will be in these rooms sitting down on a bed or whatever, and they may go 10 minutes, they may go 10 hours. People lose a sense of time. They get like someone who has tinnitus. They'll hear their own heart beating. They will be hyper aware about things. Some people will have these grand dreams that they report, or illusions or hallucinations that they have, whereas other people will just rest calmly. I'm wondering, have you or anyone ever looked into something like that? Because it would seem to me that if you are at a state of near death and your sensations, your physical sensations may be shutting down even momentarily, 5 seconds, maybe 5 hours experientially to someone. What does sensory deprivation, do you think there's any causal or any kind of relationship between that research and near-death experience?
Yes, absolutely, I do. I think that's a very good question there. First of all, I would like to clarify about the sensory deprivation tanks were made famous by John Lilly and others who were using them to explore their own minds. They were not, CIA people putting them in there. Mostly they've been, well, they might, but mostly they have been used for people's own exploration of their own minds. Even the amazing physicist Richard Feynman went into, spent many sessions with John Lilly floating in these flotation tanks and had out-of-body experiences as well. That's rather different from sitting in a room, sensory deprivation room. Now, I have done some experiments with that in my days as a parapsychologist when I was trying to discover some telepathy or clairvoyance. I did Ganzfeld experiments where you put people into this sort of partial sensory deprivation for an hour or so, and that does encourage more free-flowing imagery, and you get, the beginnings of visions. It has to be a much deeper deprivation to get real hallucinations in the sense that they feel real and you can't distinguish them from reality. That certainly happens, and you're absolutely right in your question there, that this is important for understanding near-death experiences, because many of those experiences happen when, for one reason or another, ordinary sensory input is either cut off or is so completely confused that the brain doesn't know what to do with it. So imagine you've had an accident, there's terrible noises going on, there's excruciating pain, there's blood pressure changes, the brain is going to be doing all sorts of weird things and the sensory input is not going to be making sense anymore.
Yeah.
Or imagine someone using one of the many techniques that can, with hard work, produce out-of-body experiences. Many of these techniques begin with lie down very still, don't move in a dark room, shut your eyes, deliberately cutting off sensory input. The thing is, when you've got sensory input coming from your body, so the touch and so on, and temperature and all that, that's keeping your body schema accurate, telling you, I'm lying on the bed, this is me, I'm still here. So getting rid of that means you're much more likely to get the floaty, drifty feelings that precede a full OBE. If your visual cortex is kind of disturbed, if it's got no input, it will, any sort of part of the brain, if it gets no input, it will start upping its own, decrease the threshold for cells firing and start to produce its own internally generated sort of ideas. Like when you're dreaming, the whole process of falling asleep and going into REM sleep and so on is one of cutting off their normal connections with the sensory world and allowing stuff from the inside to come bubbling up. So this is extremely relevant to near-death experiences, and it's just another reason why, in order to understand those experiences, we need to look at the capacity of the brain to generate these things, rather than kind of thinking there's a place up there where a spirit goes.
Another aspect that I don't know if anyone's ever made the connection to, when I was a kid, back in the 1980s or so, young man, after this thing with the green children in my own NDE, I started reading a lot of different books. Bud Hopkins did a book on missing time, and I read the communion books for aliens. I read books about Bigfoot and whatnot. This was long before the internet, when all this information is available, and one of the things that was interesting was the idea of this Kirlian photography, a Russian couple, and I'm not sold on that, but concomitant to that was the idea of ghost limbs. People, especially people in war who had gotten an arm, lost a leg, and they would be sitting maybe in their wheelchair and they would feel an itch in a limb that's missing. And I thought to myself then, and I still think now, I said, that's very interesting that they are somehow still sort of connecting a part of their body that is missing as if it's real. And I'm wondering if one can project onto oneself a missing limb and feel an itch. It doesn't seem that big a step after that. that one could project a whole body elsewhere. Has there ever been any connection in research into these missing limbs, actual little missing limbs, and this idea that the body can be displaced if a limb can?
Yes, there's so many things you've raised there when you were talking about the communion and all that. And I met Bud Hopkins and John Mack and all those people when I made a TV program. It's actually, I think it's on YouTube now, about alien abductions. And I met all those people and the hypnotist who hypnotized them and so on. But yes, coming back to, and Kirlian photography, let me say a little about that. I got hooked on that back in 1974 maybe. I bought myself a little Kirlian machine, and I'd read all this stuff about how if you had a leaf and you cut a bit out of it and you photographed it on the Kirlian machine, it would fill in the gap, you know. Well, it does, because the machine works by what's called corona discharge, which is a well understood physical effect when you have high voltage across a plate like that. And you know, but at the time I was sure I was going to find something exciting. And then the more experiments I did, as was with all my research, I discovered that it's a perfectly normal physical thing and it doesn't measure auras and so on and so on. But coming back to what you were talking about, missing limbs, yes, there's been some very important research that this comes back to the body schema that I was talking about earlier. In order for any animal, you know, cats, dogs, birds, whatever, to get around in the world effectively, the whole system has to have a grip on legs, arms, wings, whatever it may be, where they are all the time, constantly updated as you move. And that, it turns out, is at least to some extent inherited. And this is known because people who are born without limbs, there's the examples of thalidomide people, but there's also other occasions when people sometimes are born without limbs. They will still have a body schema with those missing limbs. They'll still be able to kind of imagine what it's like having an arm. So it's very important information that's built into your brain right from the start, that it knows what kind of body it is inhabiting and controlling.
Plasticity of mind is another thing that comes up. But people who, for example, have temporal lobe epilepsy, people who may be schizophrenic, and certain drugs can tamp this down, sometimes severing whatever it is, the thing that combines the right and left hemispheres of the brain, can have a profound effect on certain forms of epilepsy, from what I've read. I'm wondering, is there something in the structure of the human brain that we've come upon, or maybe hypothesized, that allows for us to project out these things, assuming that a near-death experience is an internal event? Is there something that's maybe goes back to us as scared little mammals hiding from saber-toothed tigers or underneath the heels of dinosaurs? I mean, is there something evolutionarily that impels the human being to want to escape its form, do you think?
Well, I don't know. That's kind of wildly speculative, isn't it? I can't immediately think how you would test that.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure we need that kind of an explanation. I mean, if you're thinking about out-of-body experiences, we know they can be set off by electrical stimulation to the right temporoparietal junction, TPJ. We know that part of the brain is involved in constructing the body schema, and what's happening when you disturb it artificially, or certain drugs and so on can do it, or near-death conditions, the body schema is just splitting. In order to keep it doing its function properly, you have to have the feedback from the, touching the fingers and touching the table and everything. And if you haven't got that, and if the whole system is being disturbed, it will split and produce two. And we've already discussed how our imaginations naturally find it easier to imagine the world from above. I assume that's because you get more information that way. It's very natural to produce maps of things. It's very hard to imagine looking at this room from the corner, the floor down there, for example. That would be very hard to do. But to imagine looking at it from up there, you imagine it as a rectangle. It's all very, it's much more simple. So I don't think we need to go back to, invent evolutionary explanations. to understand why out-of-body experiences are so common. I'm not saying it's a wrong idea, but it might be superfluous. And you're the one who will like Occam's razor, so
Yeah, no, that was total speculation. I remember seeing some shows on public television here in the U.S. A few years ago about free will, and I know you've dealt with the issue of free will as well. And basically, it was people who would be given basically an A, B, 0, 1 kind of choice to make, and testing the response times. And the thing that came through the researchers was that it seemed to be that human beings were responding more quickly to make a decision than they consciously could do so. But the thing that struck me there was that most of life's choices aren't simply A, B, black, white, 0, 1. You might have 67 options instead of 2. And so it seemed to me an autonomic response. Could it be that there's an autonomic responses that seemingly argue against free will, at least what some researchers say, that simple A-B autonomic responses could be responsible for some of this, the way that we, whatever might stimulate in the brain a near-death experience, that this is just an autonomic response that's sort of plugged into us somehow? Do you know what I'm trying to say? I'm not putting it in the best way.
Well, I want to go beyond that, really. I think that, yes, indeed, if I understand you right, I would agree. But think about everything that's going on in the brain. I mean, this struck me as a student and all my life, really. The more we understand about the world, and I'm, like scientifically curious by nature, everything you look at, well, everything, and the Buddha said this too. I mean, one of the fundamental principles in Buddhism is codependent arising. Whatever happens because of what's happened before. Things are caused by previous things. The universe probably is causally closed. So when you talk about these decisions, the brain is making, and the body together are making decisions, billions of decisions all the time. Every movement here that I'm making, and my mouth is talking, and I'm moving in my seat, and all of these are decisions going on at different levels in the muscles, in the motor cortex, in the frontal lobes. All of them are happening. And then we get this kind of, I would say, illusion, or delusion even, that there's somebody in charge in there. And the more we learn about the construction of self, the more we can see that this is a construction. There isn't somebody in there pulling the strings. But there couldn't be. So, to me, in every way I look at the world, free will simply cannot exist. I mean, there's willpower. Some people are better at saying, I'm going to do that and then doing it, or not drinking in January and not drinking in January. There's will. There's freedom. Some people are freer than others. People in prison are less free than you and me able to walk around. But the idea of free will, the idea that our will is somehow free of what the brain's doing, whether it's autonomic responses, automatic muscular responses, or anything else, is false. So, I just don't want to get tangled up with the philosophers who go on and on about determinism and free will and blah, 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 and compatibilism and incompatibilism. I don't want to do any of that stuff. I want to say, as far as I'm concerned, there cannot be such a thing as free will. So what interests me then is, how do we live our life without free will? And this, I mentioned the Buddha there. I've been training, I'm not a Buddhist, but I've been training in Chan, which is the Chinese precursor to Zen, for a very, very long time. And there you have the whole concept of non-action, or of just allowing actions to happen. And I think it is quite possible to give up the sense of free will. It's possible. I claim not to. I don't feel it anymore. I just don't believe in it. I don't feel it anymore. When difficult decisions have to be made, this thing here makes them, and the decisions get made. And sometimes that's a slow, agonizing process, like you were saying. The not black and white ones, the difficult, complicated decisions, they might take quite a long time. Other decisions just happen quickly. But as far as I'm concerned, when I think about how it's happening, I would say it's an amazingly complex, evolved, brilliant brain-body system that's getting on very well on the whole with making decisions. Mostly not too bad. Often, sometimes absolutely dreadfully wrong, but it gets on with it because that's what its job is. And there isn't any free will, and I think it's better to live without believing in free will.
You said that,
and without arguing about it too.
You said that PMH had interviewed a lot of people, and you hadn't done that. You were more doing research kind of thing. Have you come across any studies where people are influenced by a control, i.e., that you might have a group of people in a room and someone starts talking about something that they're all there to participate in, and that influences? I mean, famously, for example, people have done like candid camera things where someone is looking up at the sky and they'll say, "Oh, look at that thing in the air," and then people start looking up, and people don't want to be excluded, so they say, "Oh, I see it too." And I see it too, like I think it was the famous 1917 incident at Our Lady of Fatima or something, where people supposedly saw something on the sun, or the UFO, or the Virgin Mary. I mean,
I haven't personally done research on that sort of thing, although I did have a phase of, when I was investigating alien abductions and so on, I did have a phase of going out at night and looking at things, and we tried to induce that kind of thing by telling people that there was a UFO in a particular place, and we all ran over there and so on, and it worked to some extent. But there are well-known effects like the autokinetic effect. If you stare at a star in the dark sky that you know is perfectly still, but your eyes are moving about, your body's moving about, and unless you've got some trees or some other thing close to it, it will seem as though it's moving. You need a context for it to stay still. And this can be exploited by magicians, by psychics, and so on, because people will tend to coordinate their autokinetic response with other people, in the sense that they'll pick up body language, people sway together, or move together, or people point and they follow the pointing. And this can lead to people genuinely seeing things move in the same direction. But it's because of the way their body and their eyes are moving. Not some kind of psychic phenomenon, or not some spaceship. But it's not something that I've done proper research on myself, no.
Do you think that most people that have claimed to have near-death experiences, i.e. some kind of thing, whether it's like me at the lake, or someone who sees Jesus or the Buddha, do you think that most of them are genuine in what they're reporting, or do you think that they are mostly just being fooled into a cultural idea, or are most of them, do you think, flat out liars or fakers?
I don't know the answer to that, but my impression over decades and decades of research is that there are very few out and out liars. There are some, and some of them are awful and really, really harmful, particularly some psychics who claim to know the future and so on, do real serious harm. But they're very few. Yeah. But I would say the majority, and not quite in either of those categories, the majority of people, my starting point is always to listen to what people say, believe that they are describing as well as they can what they experienced, but I take their theories, their interpretations of what happened with a pinch of salt. So I'm kind of listening to, did they see a light? What color was the light? How far away did it seem to be? Was it moving? Those kinds of things. But when they say, it was Jesus, the light was Jesus, I'm thinking, that's just their interpretation. But it's not. I think you were sort of implying that they're sort of lying or making it up. It's not that. It's that if you've been brought up, as a Christian, with all these stories and so on, your mind will just leap to that, particularly if you're in the kind of weird state in which you may be, your brain is producing these light phenomena. And it just will seem to be Jesus to you, or whatever it is you're interpreting at. So I think actively lying is quite rare. I think adjusting your stories and changing them as you go along. We know a lot about false memory, and how the more often you tell a story, the more you are likely to use the versions that people enjoy listening to, and then you will remember the versions that you've told. So gradually the story will change. You told me an example of that right at the beginning when we were talking, must be nearly an hour ago, that we were talking about. And I think some people just allow that to happen, and they go on believing that the story they tell at the end is really the truth because I remember it. Yeah. Other people are more curious, which, you know, I'm really curious about my own descriptions of the experiences, and we'll try and check back. I write a diary. I've written a diary almost every single day since 1964, and I do go back and check things. Yeah. And when I started writing my latest book about out-of-body and near-death experiences, I started with my own experience because that's what I want to do in the end, is to try to understand what happened to me. It's a very selfish, self-indulgent project, you might say. But I was so pleased that I had two things to go on from which to check. One was my diary, in which I'd written not very much, but a couple of paragraphs. And the other was a 7-page document that I wrote 2 or 3 days after the experience, in which I wrote down everything I could remember. And I hadn't read this for quite some time. And when I went back and read it, there were a couple of things that I'd been telling wrong. There were 2 things that I'd got in the wrong order. And I was really interested to see that. And well, I'm really glad I wrote that down and I could check. It wasn't, you know, terribly significant, but everybody's stories change a bit as they go along. And we just need to be a little bit, on the one hand, be a bit careful and try to keep them accurate if we want them to. And the second thing, to know that that's how human minds work.
I've read of people who have been interviewed over the course of decades, sort of like the old Up series movies where the children are visited every 7 years, where people are asked about certain events like their high school graduation, their first marriage, their parents' death. And it seems to me that there's a human tendency to just adumbrate, and we censor. Sometimes we'll drop a little thing, and then 3 tellings later we'll add something in, and we think it's all is there. Let me just, as we wrap up, you seem to embrace the scientific method. When I spoke with PMH, she was not big on the scientific method, and if I'm mischaracterizing, people can watch that video and hear it in her own words. But falsifiability is key. What would change your mind? Would Harry Houdini have to come back as a ghost and say, you know, I'm here and I can prove that I was Harry Houdini? You know, what would falsify your current belief against near-death experiences or the afterlife?
There are 2 main things that would make me say, wow, I was so wrong. I mean, it wouldn't make me say I was wrong about everything. It would make me say, we really have to rethink a lot of this. One would be if it's a question of timing in near-death experiences. Almost all of the famous cases, you know, Maria's shoe on the ledge, Pam Reynolds' thing, the glasses man, the glasses in the drawer. All of these cases depend critically on the timing. What we need to know is, do people have near-death experiences when there is no brain activity? A single case that is convincing in showing us that the near-death experience itself happened when the brain was dead. We don't have that evidence yet, even though there are many claims out there. If that kind of evidence came, then I would go, wow, that really is showing us that there's very much more to consciousness than appears at the moment. The other would be, and again, there are many claims at this time, but I have spent an awful lot of time looking into the evidence, and it gets less and less compelling as you go on. That is paranormal abilities. If somebody really is able during a near-death experience to fly to, you gave the example of Pluto, but let's say down the corridor in the hospital or back to their hometown or whatever, and give information that they couldn't possibly have known, then I'm wrong. And it may happen. I would say I had to change my mind really big time decades and decades ago. I was, you know, as a student, I used to wear all these hippie gear, and I read tarot cards, and I trained as a witch, and I did had a crystal ball and all of this stuff, and I you know, was completely convinced by various occult theories, and it was evidence that made me change my mind. And it's hard, you know. My whole persona was bound up with this stuff. That's who I was, Sue, the psychic one, you know, that sort of thing. And I changed my mind, and lo and behold, it's quite possible, and actually, it's fine. And the world then becomes more interesting. Okay, all those ideas don't work. How about this? Oh, no, that doesn't work. How about this? You know? So I know that, painful as it would be to go, I was completely wrong, I would do it if that sort of evidence came along and was good enough to be compelling. So, yeah, those are the two main sorts. We shall see.
Yeah. Well, SusanBlackmore.co.uk is your website. I will link to that below this video. I'll also have reciprocal links between yours and PMH's videos so people can watch you back to back and explore the differences of opinion that you have. I wish that we could have had you both on at once, but as you can tell from sort of the echo in the background, we were having some issues with, I guess, one of your computers couldn't get us and whatnot. But anyway, it's stimulating hour and with you as well. And I want to thank you for your time.
Oh, it's been fun. I'm very sorry that we didn't get together with both of us. I would really have enjoyed to talk to PMH. It would have been great. But that's life, and it's been fun talking to you. Thank you very much.